A newly appointed black police chief goes undercover to observe his own precinct, but is humiliated and spit on by a white officer. When the truth is revealed, the bully is stunned to learn who he really insulted. Will justice be served? What secrets will come to light? On a sweltering July morning, the heat suffocated the city of Brookdale, Georgia. The temperature soared to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the air thick and stifling. Standing outside the precinct, Marcus Ellington, 45 years old, a black man with a determined gaze, took a deep breath. Today wasn't his first day in law enforcement, but it was his first as police chief, a position that could finally bring change to a corrupt system. But Marcus didn't want a grand welcome. He wanted the truth. Dressed in a worn-out flannel shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he blended in as an ordinary civilian. His plan was simple but bold, to expose the real face of the precinct before they had a chance to put on their masks. With measured steps, he entered the station, ready to confront the deep-seated corruption lurking within. Marcus walked slowly into the Brookdale Police Department, his sharp eyes scanning the room with the calmness of a seasoned veteran. Under the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights, the precinct buzzed with chatter and laughter. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and old paperwork, creating a familiar yet suffocating atmosphere. No one paid him any attention, exactly as he had planned. But that silence didn't last long. A voice rang out, dripping with disdain. "Look at this guy. What, looking for a janitor job?" Marcus turned. Standing in front of him was Brent Walker, 38 years old, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a crisp uniform and an arrogant smirk. Brent was no stranger to controversy. His reputation for brutality against civilians, especially black men, was well known. But thanks to his connections, he had always managed to dodge accountability. The room fell silent, not out of concern, but anticipation. Marcus remained still, his face unreadable. That seemed to irritate Brent even more. With a sudden aggressive shove, he slammed Marcus backward into a file cabinet, the metal rattling from the impact. "I told you, this place isn't for trash like you." Brent chuckled, glancing around at his fellow officers, expecting laughter. And he got it. Some laughed openly. A few clapped him on the back, encouraging his actions. Others simply stood still, watching with blank expressions, unwilling to get involved. Marcus still said nothing. Slowly he straightened himself, brushed off his old flannel shirt, and locked eyes with Brent. That look, steady, unwavering, made Brent uneasy. His smirk twisted into something darker. Without warning, Brent spat directly into Marcus's face. The room froze. The laughter died instantly. Some officers exchanged nervous glances. Others shuffled uncomfortably, sensing that the situation had taken a turn. Marcus stood still, his breath slow, his face unreadable. He felt the warm spit drip down his cheek, but he didn't react. Not immediately. The tension in the air thickened, pressing against every person in the room. Brent was still grinning, thinking he had put a lesser man in his place. But when he finally met Marcus's eyes again, his stomach twisted, because there was no anger, no humiliation, only a piercing, calculating coldness. Slowly, Marcus pulled a neatly folded handkerchief from his pocket, wiping his face with deliberate precision, as if he were brushing off a speck of dust rather than an act of pure disrespect. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He just stood there. And that silence, that terrifying, unwavering silence, was worse than any retaliation Brent could have expected. For the first time, Brent felt a flicker of unease. He had expected rage, a reaction, maybe even a fight. Instead, Marcus remained composed, unshaken. The air in the room had shifted, and now, even Brent's supporters were beginning to sense something was wrong. And then, as if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately. The new police chief has arrived." Brent scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Great. Let's see what clown they put in charge this time." He had no idea. Marcus, now finished wiping his face, tucked the handkerchief back into his pocket, adjusted his collar, and turned toward the door. His steps were slow, measured, not those of a defeated man, but of a warrior stepping onto the battlefield. The sharp buzz of the intercom cut through the humid morning air like a blade. "All personnel report to the briefing room immediately. The new police chief has arrived." The usual chatter in the precinct faded. Officers exchanged curious glances, some shrugging indifferently, but one man scoffed, Brent Walker. Leaning back against the desk, arms crossed, he smirked. "Let's see what kind of coward they're putting in charge this time." A few officers chuckled. Others simply shook their heads and made their way toward the briefing room. No one, not even Brent, had the slightest idea of the storm about to hit. The briefing room was packed. Rows of chairs filled with officers, some standing in the back, sipping coffee, others leaning against the walls, waiting. The air was thick with indifference, boredom, and mild curiosity, as if this was just another routine announcement. Brent stood near the back, relaxed, smirking, arms still folded across his chest. Then the door opened. A figure stepped in. The low murmurs died instantly. Smirks froze in place. Some officers blinked, as if not trusting their own eyes. Brent felt a strange chill creep down his spine. His smirk faltered. His body stiffened. He squinted, trying to get a clearer look at the man walking toward the podium. And then the realization hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. It was Marcus Ellington. Brent's entire body locked up. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His jaw tensed. His breathing hitched. This couldn't be happening. Marcus walked up to the podium, calm and controlled, his eyes sweeping over the room. Not a single person dared to move, because now they knew. They had laughed, they had mocked, they had humiliated the man who was about to lead them. Brent felt his stomach drop like a lead weight. The blood drained from his face, leaving it ashen pale. He couldn't breathe. Marcus's gaze finally landed on him, slow, calculated, cold. Brent's throat tightened. His body screamed at him to look away, but he couldn't break eye contact. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on every single officer. Marcus stepped closer to the microphone. His voice, steady and firm, cut through the silence. "My name is Marcus Ellington." The words sliced through the room like a scalpel through flesh. Some officers swallowed hard. Others stared at the floor, avoiding his gaze. "I am your new chief of police." Brent gripped his fists, his nails digging into his palms. His breath came short and shallow. Marcus let the words sink in, watching as their weight settled over the room. Then he continued. "This morning I walked into this precinct as an ordinary man, and what I witnessed was the truth you could never hide." A few officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. Marcus's eyes locked onto Brent again, holding for just a moment too long, making it painfully clear to everyone in the room exactly who he was talking about. Brent felt like the walls were closing in. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Just silence. The silence of men who had just realized their entire world had turned upside down. The air in the briefing room was suffocating, thick with tension like a brewing storm. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Every pair of eyes was locked onto the man standing at the podium, Marcus Ellington. His gaze swept across the room, cold and unwavering. There were no more smirks, no more arrogance, only silence and fear. Then he spoke. His voice was deep and steady, each word as sharp as a blade cutting through steel. "I came here this morning to observe, and I was not disappointed. I saw exactly who you are." A wave of unease rippled through the room. Some officers swallowed hard. Others wiped the sweat forming on their brows. At the back of the room, Brent Walker stood frozen. His body tensed, his pulse hammered in his ears. A cold sweat crept down his neck. For the first time in his life, Brent Walker felt small. The officers who had laughed alongside him just moments ago now avoided his gaze. They too knew this was not a game. Brent tried to keep his voice steady, but it cracked. "Sir, I didn't mean..." Bang! The sharp slam of Marcus's palm against the table echoed through the room, making the entire surface tremble. Brent flinched, instinctively stepping back. A few officers blinked, others held their breath. Marcus leaned forward, his hands pressed against the table, his piercing eyes locking onto Brent. "No." His voice was dangerously calm, more terrifying than any yell. "You didn't care. You didn't bother to look at me twice before you spat on my face. You didn't see a man. You saw a black man and assumed I didn't belong here." Brent stood paralyzed, his fists clenching at his sides. His body screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Marcus slowly straightened, inhaling deeply before delivering his next words. "You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the badge you wear. You disrespected the oath you swore to uphold. You are the very reason this department is rotting from the inside." Brent's world came crashing down. A cold chill ran down his spine, his heartbeat pounding in his throat. He glanced around, searching for support, but there was none. The same officers who once patted him on the back now refused to meet his eyes. Marcus turned toward the command staff, his voice unwavering. "Brent Walker, you are immediately suspended pending an internal investigation." The room went deathly silent. No one objected. Marcus continued, "And let me be very clear, this is not a warning. This is just the beginning." Brent opened his mouth, but no words came out. His throat tightened, suffocated by his own humiliation. No one stood up for him. No one laughed. He was now a man abandoned, alone in the same room where he had once commanded respect. Marcus held his gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back, his eyes sweeping across every officer in the room. If anyone here still thinks what happened this morning was acceptable, listen carefully. I am not here to be your friend. I am here to change this department. And if you can't handle that, the door's right there. No one spoke. No one moved, because they all knew the old way was dead. Brent Walker wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. He couldn't shake the humiliation of being publicly put in his place by the new police chief in front of the entire precinct. The shock on the faces of the officers who once laughed with him, the ones who had treated him as a leader, had now fallen silent, consumed by fear. But Brent wasn't about to let this slide. He quietly sought out the disgruntled officers, the ones who felt Marcus was a threat to the old order, the ones who hated change, the ones who believed Marcus didn't deserve the position he held. We can't let him run this place, Brent whispered to a group of officers after hours. If we don't do something, he'll push us out one by one. Some nodded in agreement, their silence speaking volumes. These were the ones who thrived under a broken system, where they could manipulate reports, turn a blind eye to misconduct, and still keep their badges. And Marcus was the wrench in their machine. Brent wasn't going to let him get comfortable. The first warning came late at night while Marcus was in his office, reviewing case files. His phone buzzed. An anonymous message. Get out before it's too late. Your seat isn't as stable as you think. Marcus stared at the screen, but his expression didn't change. He had expected this. The second warning came the next day. As Marcus stepped out of the precinct toward his car, he stopped abruptly. The driver's side window was shattered, glass fragments littering the seat. On the steering wheel, a neatly folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. This is your final warning. Marcus took a slow, deep breath, but his gaze remained unwavering. They wanted him to be afraid. They wanted him to back down, but they miscalculated. The next morning, a full-scale internal investigation was launched. Marcus ordered a deep dive into every disciplinary report and complaint in the Brookdale Police Department. Every accusation against Brent and his allies was dug up. Nothing was off limits. Brutality against civilians, falsified reports, turning a blind eye to misconduct. One by one, the files piled up on Marcus's desk, undeniable evidence of a precinct rotting from within. And this time, there was no one left to cover for Brent. But Brent wasn't going down without a fight. The officers loyal to him started whispering about a rebellion. They boycotted Marcus, deliberately ignoring his orders. Reports went missing. Patrols were delayed. They wanted chaos. They wanted to make Marcus look like a failure. But Marcus wasn't an easy target. He tightened his grip on internal affairs, revised reporting structures, and kept a close eye on every move within the department. Those who thought they could challenge him would find no escape. The battle between reform and resistance had officially begun. The truth always finds a way to surface. A thick stack of case files sat on Marcus Ellington's desk, each page a damning indictment against Brent Walker. Documents, testimonies, surveillance footage, all painting a picture of a man who had long operated above the law. The internal investigation was over, and the results were exactly what Marcus had expected. Brent Walker wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symbol of a broken system. Excessive force against civilians? Confirmed. More than a dozen complaints, many of which had been conveniently buried. Racist comments in internal reports? Undeniable. His own handwriting, his own words, repeated over and over throughout the years. Protection from higher ups? Without question. Senior officers had covered for him, erased evidence, and turned a blind eye. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus knew that today would mark the beginning of a new era in the Brookdale Police Department. That morning, the entire precinct was called into the briefing room. Brent Walker walked in, his usual smug expression barely masking the unease in his eyes. He could sense what was coming. Marcus stood at the front, a folder in his hands. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was enough. The internal investigation is complete, Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room. Brent Walker, you have been found guilty of excessive force against civilians, repeatedly making racist remarks in official reports, and being shielded by those who abuse their power to protect you. The air turned to ice. Brent froze in his seat. The officers who had once stood by him shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale with realization. Marcus locked eyes with Brent, his voice sharp and final. Brent Walker, you are hereby terminated, effective immediately. The room stopped breathing. This decision is final, and let me make one thing clear. You will never wear this badge again. Brent shot to his feet, his face burning red with fury. "You can't do this to me," he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not doing this to you, Brent. You did this to yourself." Brent's fist clenched, his jaw tightened so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. But there was no escape. Two officers stepped forward, removing his badge and gun. He jerked his arms away, but resisting was pointless. Brent turned toward the door, his steps slow and heavy. For the first time, he was no longer the most powerful man in the room. But the fallout didn't stop with Brent. The officers who had once sided with him began to panic. They knew the purge wasn't over. Some quietly submitted their resignation papers, realizing there was no place for them in this new system. Others chose to adapt, abandoning the toxic mindset they had clung to for years. Marcus knew this battle wasn't over, but today he had done what no one else had dared to do. Today, a new chapter began for Brookdale. 1 year later, the Brookdale Police Department was no longer a place filled with cynical laughter, whispered deals, or quiet cover-ups. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Officers were now chosen for their integrity, not their connections. Those who couldn't adapt to fairness and accountability were gone, replaced by men and women who wore their badges with pride and purpose. This change didn't come easily. Marcus knew that reform was never instant. But as he watched new officers step through the precinct doors each morning, he knew the seeds he had planted had begun to take root. One late afternoon, at a community event in the park, Marcus stood among families and children, watching as officers engaged with the people they served. Brookdale felt different now, lighter, safer. As he was speaking with a local resident, he suddenly felt a small tug on his sleeve. "Sir?" Marcus looked down to see a young boy, around 10 years old, his wide eyes filled with curiosity, but also doubt. "Can you really change the police?" The boy's voice was quiet, but his question carried weight. Marcus paused. The question came from a child, but it represented an entire generation growing up uncertain about justice. Slowly, he knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, his tone steady but warm. "Every big change starts with a small step. I can't fix the past, but I can help build a better future." The boy stayed silent for a moment, as if thinking it over. Then, for the first time, he smiled softly, nodded, and ran off to join his friends. Marcus watched him go, feeling a quiet warmth settle in his chest. That night, Marcus returned to the precinct and stood just outside the main entrance, watching. The new officers walked in with purpose, their greetings no longer exchanges of unspoken corruption, but genuine camaraderie between colleagues who respected the job they had sworn to do. A cool breeze drifted through the night air, carrying with it the promise of a changing Brookdale. Marcus took a deep breath, then murmured to himself, "We still have a long road ahead, but at least this is a start." Justice isn't just words, it's action. Marcus Ellington didn't come to Brookdale to talk about change. He came to make it happen. This story is proof that those who abuse power will eventually face the consequences. A system may be broken, but no system is beyond repair, as long as someone is willing to stand up and face the truth. The fight for justice is never easy. It's filled with resistance, threats, and obstacles, but courage isn't about defeating an enemy. It's about having the strength to confront what's wrong and the determination to make it right. Brookdale has changed, but the journey isn't over, because justice isn't a destination. It's a road we must keep walking.